Welcome, everyone. My name is Vanessa Conlin, Master of Wine and the Head of Wine at Wine Access. And I have to say, this is truly an honor today to be joined on this Zoom, not just by some outstanding vintners, but by people who have been friends of mine through various parts of my life and my career. So it's really such a joy to see not only these amazing personalities, but also these friends. So I'm going to kick things off, and thank you for joining us again. So Sonoma, why are we here? Well, Sonoma is a very large, diverse growing region. It's about twice the size of neighboring Napa County. It ranges quite a bit in terroir, climate, aspect, ranging from, the cool Sonoma coast, known for varieties like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, to more landlocked regions like Dry Creek, known for varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon and Zinfandel. The first grapes were planted in 1812 by Russians, but it's come a long way from its Russian and missionary background. And here today, we are going to discuss the future, the challenges, the opportunities, and how these 5 panelists are going to shape the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years and beyond of the history of Sonoma. So I'd like to begin with a few introductions and biographies, and apologies in advance. I know it's always excruciating to hear your own bio read in front of you, but this is such an amazing group. We do have to cover at least a little background. In no particular order, Carlo Mondavi, thank you so much for joining. Carlo is the wine grower, visionary, and creative force behind all aspects of RAEN Winery. He accredits his grandfather, Robert Mondavi, as his inspiration in wine, and his father, Tim, owner and winemaker at Continuum Winery, as his greatest teacher. In 2013, Carlo founded RAEN Winery along with his brother Dante to focus on producing world-class Pinot Noir along the western reaches of Sonoma coast. The name RAEN itself is a double entendre. It tells the story of rainwater becoming wine in the vineyards, filtered through the soil into the grapes. But it also stands for Research in Agriculture and Enology Naturally. Carlo is the founder of Monarch Challenge, an organization devoted to eliminating completely herbicides, fungicides, and pesticides in both Sonoma and Napa County permanently. Their work has led to the creation of the Monarch Tractor in 2019, an electric vehicle designed to support the intricacies and demands of sustainable agriculture. Thank you so much, Carlo, for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Vanessa.
Next, we have George Hamel III, affectionately known as G3, who is the managing director overseeing sales, financial, and business operations at Hamel Family Wines. George has a BA from Bard College and an MBA from Sonoma State University Wine Business Institute. Prior to joining Hamel Family Wines, George was a financial advisor with the private wealth management group of Wells Fargo. While he thrived in the investment world, he found himself wanting to return to the West Coast, where his family resides, and began looking for ways to get back to California. Around the same time, George's parents, Pamela and George Jr., I hope they're watching, hi George and Pam if you are, were entering the wine industry, and G3 jumped at the once-in-a-chance lifetime opportunity to build a multi-generational family wine business. G3 enjoys spending free time with his wife, family, and 2 dogs while actively supporting his community in a variety of ways, including his volunteer work at Jameson Humane, where he's on the board of directors with me. So such a pleasure to have you here, G3. Morgan Twain-Peterson MW. Morgan grew up in the world of wine. His parents, Joel Peterson and Kate Twain, were both employees at the local hospital in Sonoma. Joel's main job was running the bacteriology lab at Sonoma Valley Hospital. However, as a second job, he also worked at a small passion project called Ravenswood Winery. Morgan began making small lots of Pinot Noir at age 5. I definitely need to sidebar with you about that later, lots of questions, from fruit given to him by the San Giacomo family. Though always enamored with the wine industry, Morgan bypassed a traditional viticultural and enology degree and instead attended Vassar College and Columbia University, focusing on his other loves of history and political science. After graduate school, Morgan decided to come back to California to more fully immerse himself in the wine industry, working here, Australia, and Bordeaux. Bedrock Wine Company was started in 2007 out of a friend's tiny winery on the outskirts of the town of Sonoma and quickly rose to prominence for making world-class wines from select vineyards and old vine heritage sites. So welcome, Morgan. Jasmine Hirsch. Jasmine was born and raised in Northern California. She was baptized in Champaign, I knew I loved you, by her wine-loving parents, David and Rebecca Hirsch, and spent her childhood at Hirsch Vineyards. After graduating from the University of Pennsylvania in 2001, Jasmine spent 5 years working in Europe, followed by 2 years in New York at JP Morgan. She escaped from corporate life to take over sales and marketing at Hirsch in 2008. In 2015, she became general manager of the winery, and 2019 vintage marked her first vintage as winemaker. So thank you, Jasmine. Last but not least, Artie Johnson. Artie is a fifth generation Texan, not fifth generation, but fellow Texan, attended the prestigious Kincaid School in Houston prior to enrolling at the University of Texas McComb School of Business. Post-college, Artie's food and wine journey began in the restaurant industry in Austin. Soon after, he made his way to New York to work at Nobu in Tribeca. Manhattan prepared Artie for his first wine and beverage director position at Casa Urina, in the Versace Mount Mansion in Miami Beach. During his 7 years in Miami, he contributed to South Beach staples such as Casa Tua and Prime 112, great restaurant, before moving to California. Artie's Napa career began in 2013 at Harlan Estate and then Mayacamas Vineyards in 2014. In 2015, Johnson founded the Artishasic winery as proprietor and winemaker under his parent company, Wine XYZ, a consulting firm for Johnson to help small family-owned wineries excel in direct-to-consumer strategies. Whew, all right, I'm out of breath. So with that, thank you everyone again for being here. If you joined us a little late, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat or the Q&A, but let's get started. There's so much to ask. So I'm gonna put you on the spot first, Carlo, with this question to open up the conversation. But my question is, so your grandfather was one of the most famous promoters of wine as a part of a complete life in general, but specifically raised awareness of the Napa Valley. So why did you and your brother choose to make wine in Sonoma?
Well, so thanks, Vanessa, and amazing being here with you all, especially this incredible panel you put together. So thank you for including myself and also my brother, one of the visionaries of RAEN. But so my grandfather, one thing he taught me was that sight was so vital in wine, that, you know, if you wanted to really make a wine that could sit with great wines of the world, you had to find an exceptional site first, and then you had to treat it very well, and then have a deep understanding of winemaking to really be able to excel. And so Dante and I have been inspired by the Pinot Noirs of Jasmine's father and family, of the neighbors that are out there on the true Sonoma coast. And so when we went to think about Pinot Noir after my family lost Robert Mondavi in 2004, we were just thinking along that edge of the true Sonoma coast and just how elegant. It's one of the coolest sites in the world. It's cooler than Burgundy and in many vintages, especially with climate change impacting continental sites the way that it is, and us on the coast. But it's an incredible site. So just the ability to have such a great connection to a diverse terroir, and then also that cool influence from that coastal site. So cool. Good retention of acidity, freshness, and vibrancy. But you know, I think that's the biggest thing is sight, and that's something my grandfather taught my brother and I and my family. Sight comes first, and so that's one of the reasons why we're out there on the true Sonoma coast.
Got it. So similar question, G3 to you, because when I first met you, I was working at Donna Estates in Napa Valley. I know you and your family to be great appreciators of Napa, and also actually have done quite a bit for in the nonprofit world here as well. So same question, what drove your family's decision to invest in Sonoma?
Well, I think, you know, we appreciate the fine wines of the world, and those come from all over, from where Carlo is in Italy to France to Northern California and the like. And you know, we have been enamored with a lot of the wines coming out of Napa Valley, but it felt right for us to be in Sonoma. And I think for a long time, some really amazing vineyard sites have kind of been not disregarded, but have just kind of been passed over in Sonoma. And I think, as Carlo was just talking about, site matters. There are some sites that rival any place, in my own opinion, in the world here in Sonoma and Sonoma County. And as you said, it's so large that there are these incredibly diverse AVAs that there's not really a place in the world that has such diversity. And you know, apart from the work of the people on this panel, one of the people on this panel, Morgan, has really been a champion of some of these heritage vineyard sites and really preserving that history of Northern California's wine history. And, you know, what we were really enamored with is trying to do what he's done and what his family's done in terms of finding these really underappreciated sites that could really, from a farming philosophy for us that centers around biodynamic and organic farming and dry farming as a whole, could really bring out this wonderful, expressive and impressive terroir that Sonoma County, for us, it's Sonoma Valley and the Moon Mountain District, are the two AVAs that we focus on. And really think that what this panel is doing is really just trying to elevate the quality that comes from Sonoma. And, you know, us aside, I think everyone is doing a really wonderful job in terms of bringing Sonoma's name and small wineries like us up with them from a quality standpoint.
Got it. And so Artie, maybe I'll sort of follow up on this question with you, because as we've heard from G3 and from Carlo, I mean, it's such a diverse region, is such a large region with 18 AVAs. So from a consumer perspective, you know, what's the best way to describe it, being that there's no sort of one descriptor that's going to encompass the entire county? How would you best sort of explain Sonoma to consumers?
Well, you know, first of all, you know, it's an absolute honor to be here. I'm here with my peers, but I'm here with some of the most talented people in the wine business, and not just locally, I think globally. So, you know, it's very humbling to be here. Relationships brought me to Sonoma. So Phil Couturi, who's a mentor of mine, I made my first Sonoma Syrah at Bartholomew Park Vineyard, a vineyard that Morgan is very familiar with. And that was Phil's 20th in last year. And then I followed him over to Rossi Ranch and Steel Plow as well. And then in terms of Chardonnay, my relationships with Ross Cobb and Katie Wilson brought me over there as well. So for me, Sonoma is about relationships. It's a beautiful countryside. It's very diverse. I love what's happening kind of with the West Sonoma Coast push, because I believe that, you know, if they're ready to push and bring people to the region, then let them do it. You know, the natural kind of vibe is to want everybody to push at the same time, but I think those guys are ready to go, so let them go. I don't think it detracts from the region at all. So people are going to have to start learning these different areas. I work in the Sonoma Valley with Syrah, and it's completely different than on the coast. I mean, if you're west facing in the Sonoma Valley, you need to take that fruit off sometimes. You know, it can be pretty warm. So I think the consumer really needs to understand the diversity, and the diversity is key. And when they come out, go to different areas and experience that. And the more these regions can push ahead, and you can see what's happened with us, you know, over in Napa and Oakville and Rutherford have pushed ahead. They brought more people to the valley, and then people get up in the mountains and they get to the other areas. So it's really about letting each region be who they are and then expressing that to the consumer. Got it.
And Jasmine, next question for you, but I totally agree with what Artie said. This is one of just an incredible panel. But on this panel, and of the wineries, I should say, represented here, yours is the only winery with more than 15 years of history. So do you think that this past experience in Sonoma has given you a different perspective? And if so, what would your advice be to these sort of, younger upstarts here on this panel in terms of wineries?
I'm not going to attempt to give advice to any of these amazing people. I think that I am just more and more struck every day by how much work we still have to do. And I mean that, here at Hirsch, I mean that as a region, and then obviously also as a society, right? When we look at climate change, So I think that the longer I work here at Hirsch, I just see the potential to do better, to do more, to learn more about the vineyards, about the ecology, about the soils, about the winemaking. And, my father always says the most important thing is to recognize what you don't know. And the more you spend time in something as complex as viticulture or winemaking, in general, just, ecology and soils, the more you realize, there's so much to know, and that makes you realize how little you do know. So I just am constantly, it's sometimes overwhelmed, but also just eager to keep working and to take better care of this incredible land that we've been privileged to be responsible for. And then alongside that, if you add on climate change, I mean, things are changing so quickly, so much more quickly than farmers of the past had to deal with, right? So, the things that we thought would hold true and that we kind of got a handle on something in our vineyards or whatever, here we are 5 years later, and it's like, we don't know, we don't have a handle on anything, so we not only do we have to learn in the normal sense of being a young human on this planet and only having so many years on this planet, but we also are facing accelerated change in our environment. And as farmers, I mean, that's everything. So, I don't feel that, we've been here for 40 years, but we've only been making wine for 20, and 40 years is just the beginning. Viticulture is not on the time scale of one generation of a human being. It truly needs to be multi-generational. And, it's so exciting for Sonoma County to be at the point that it's at, where it's like, we've got now some decades of experience. And, we are now really starting to, to kind of, to George's point, like starting to really find and identify those incredible sites. But that's just the beginning. So now, we've found those amazing sites, but maybe our fathers or our grandfathers didn't plant them right because they were the first people to plant them. So now we're in that second stage. And, my dad is 77 and he's planting new vineyards, and it's such an extraordinary, I mean, I'm getting chills just thinking about it. It's such an extraordinary thing to be 77 and planting a new vineyard, because you won't see the full potential of that. So you're doing it for the next generation. So I'm sure Morgan, new dad, I'm sure you're thinking about planting vineyards for your baby, and that's good, because train them right and they'll be able to keep on with your vision, because none of us have enough time in our lifetime to fully realize everything we want to do here. So yeah.
And actually, Morgan, that leads to a question. Then, we're talking about kind of change and thinking ahead to the future. And I know that you're such a viticultural pioneer and always, pushing the limits and trying new things, but you also work with these amazing heritage sites with old vines. So do you kind of have to put two hats on when you're dealing with these older sites, and then you're looking to the future, or how do you divide your energy among those that dichotomy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I mean, first off, it's incredible being here. And I just wanted to point out, like George, as you're pointing out, George's ranch is part of the original property that Bedrock was part of too. So we're literally next to each other. And like when you have somebody like Pedro Parra come out and just start going agog over the soils, I'm a Sonoma Valley boy, so you just kind of assume it was there. And then when something like that happens, you go, oh, it really did have all that potential we thought it did. So it's very cool that you're doing that. And it's just great to see all of your faces. So yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting about working with old vineyards is that in some ways, I think that there's some keys in old vineyards that will allow us to address what we do in the future in many ways. If you think about the ways that a lot of these old vineyards were planted, many of them were field ones. Many of them were literally planted with the idea that there was risk mitigation built into how they were planted, because the planters knew, because they were just figuring it out post-phylloxera in the 1880s and 1890s. So they were planting varieties that they knew might work together and make a certain style of wine, but they also knew that in a really, really cold year, the Petit Syrah or the early ripe or the Tempranillo or the early ripening varieties were going to get ripe. And then the later ripening varieties would do better in later years, the Mataro and the Grenache, all with the aim of sort of building in sort of necessary diversification in some ways. And honestly, as we're redeveloping vineyards in at Bedrock and across other of our properties. I mean, we're redeveloping them as field blends. We're also redeveloping them on a much wider spacing because that is what has allowed for our oldest vineyards to be dry farmed. And, you know, as we move into a more uncertain future in terms of water and resources and everything else, not only is soil health and soil biome and all the modern science that we know about biology and all of that stuff so incredibly important, it's also good to look back and be like, hey, you know what, planting on a 9x9 or a 10x10 actually has some merit, considering the fact that water is going to become an increasingly scarce thing. And, you know, we've been talking about how little rainfall that we got this year. And you know, it's going to be tough, but I know that, you know, our old vine vineyards have seen something similar in the past and they'll get through it. It's just, you know, so, you know, as we're replanting vineyards, we're replanting on, you know, wide spacing and going towards hedge training and trying to sort of rethink and reimagine things in a way that I think if my dad was redeveloping a vineyard in the 1980s or 1990s, he never would have done, because that just wasn't sort of the thinking of the time. So I think that there's some mysteries to unlock in those old vineyards that are really quite cool. But at the same time, it's also really important to, you know, dovetail that with our modern understanding of soil science and health and, you know, just the way that you can, you know, there's just so much more information that we have at our fingertips now as we're laying things out.
So kind of follow-up question, Morgan, about old vines. So how long can those actually be economically viable, and when do you make the decision that they're not?
So in my opinion, I think that vines become economically viable when they stop being cared for. So the vineyards that I see that have been ripped out for the most part are those in which there's been so much deferred maintenance, where for economic reasons a farmer doesn't get enough, you know, money for his grapes to be able to rationalize the inputs that are necessary to replant positions as they die out, or to spread compost, or to do like the necessary vineyard practice. You know, some of the oldest vineyards we work with, Evangela Vineyard, which is own rooted and planted in beach sand and it's 130 years old, that vineyard has been incredibly well cared for its entire life, and it still yields 3.5 to 4 tons per acre every year. So, you know, and you look at the oldest vines in the old world, like the own rooted vines you see in the Rioja Baixas in Spain, and I mean, those are still economically productive and they're 150 to 180 years old in some points. So I think a lot of it has to do much more with cultural practice and intent. And most of the old vines that we have seen become economically non-entities are usually due to sort of human abandonment rather than, or lack of good cultural practice than the vines themselves going downhill. I mean, there are certain things like bad viruses and other stuff that can come in that can mitigate and create some issues. But again, that's very varietally dependent. And there's ways that you can mitigate that as well. Usually I think the things that, you know, stop old vines from surviving are deferred maintenance, unpopularity of variety, or, you know, marketability, or other market forces. You know, out in Contra Costa County where Evangelo is, you know, vineyards are selling for $250,000 an acre to tract home developers because, you know, rapid transit's headed that way. So unfortunately, that's, you know, all of a sudden that's where, you know, it's broader scale economic stuff that sometimes, you know, is the reason for their demise.
Got it. George, the next question is for you, but it made me think of this because Morgan mentioned Pedro Parra, Chilean viticultural expert and consultant, and I know that you've also worked with Alberto Antonini from Italy in that regard. So I guess I'm curious, what sort of insights did these experts from other countries and other wine regions help you understand about your own vineyards?
Yeah, well, first, I was so focused on the question and a bit nervous that I forgot to thank you, Vanessa, and everybody else on the panel. And so I was the only one that didn't want to think that I wasn't so grateful for being asked. I think out of everybody here, I'm probably the least qualified. And before I answer the question, there is one other thing that I do think speaks to how Sonoma is increasing in type of respect for the wines that we're creating here. Morgan was, in his winery, Bedrock, was named Winery of the Year from Venice this past year. And I mean, for Sonoma winery and a Sonoma Valley winery to get that. That meant a lot, and also is motivation for us that, you know, the rising tide lifts all boats. So it's just great that, you know, that type of I mean, it's you know, Morgan is, it was very well received, I would say, in terms of what he's been able to do. And provides us motivation as well. But getting to your question, you know, even though some of my other colleagues on this panel come from multi-generational wine families, my brother and I don't. You know, we're kind of, we're starting this wine journey together alongside our parents. And as we kind of develop as a company, individuals within this wine space, we thought it was important for my brother, who is our director of wine growing and winemaker, that he learns from some of the best and brightest minds as he kind of continues his development. And so first, we were working with Martha McClellan, based over in Napa, and was just super New World focused. And we always want to try to get better and be able to think about a lot of the things that we see in the vineyard and the winery with a lot of different perspectives and through a lot of different lenses. And so we have to Jasmine's point, I don't think the more we know, the less we know. And so we started this program that every 5 years we change our winemaking consultant, just so we can have a new, fresh set of ideas, and just to kind of look at the wines we're doing and making sure that we are getting better. And so after Martha, we thought that we'd look to the old world, because as I said during my first answer, we're appreciative of all of the great wines from around the world. And so through Pedro Parra, has worked on some different projects with Alberto. And so we were put in touch with him, and my brother and Alberto just clicked immediately and have just been really great for our wines and for the business, in terms of getting his knowledge, expertise from just being from over in Italy and consulting on wine projects from all over the world, and has a massive knowledge that he can bestow upon us for us to use within our own program.
So we're talking about sort of also, you know, learnings about the soils, about the region, and the sharing of information. So that kind of leads me, Carlo, I'd love to actually pose this question to you, because also George mentioned, you know, the a rising tide lifts all ships or all boats. And I know that, you know, Robert Mondavi was a huge proponent of that in Napa. So is there that type of community in Sonoma, being that it's such a sort of a larger and more diverse region than Napa? Do you feel like there is a sort of sense of community and sense of sharing, or is it a little bit more localized to certain EVAs?
No, I mean, yeah, it's so true. My grandfather, I always joke that the goodwill that he had in Napa transferred over into Napa or into Sonoma, being that one of the first people that took me under their wing was Michael Brown, and he kind of showed me around. He actually led me out to Fort Ross Seaview through Charles Ranch Vineyard, and then I met a consultant that led me to a vineyard just beyond Jasmine's vineyard there at the Hellenthal Ranch, and kind of like Artie was saying, I mean, it's just this community, and it's incredible. If you run out of something, I mean, some of the first wines that we made at RAEN were at Morgan's winery there on 8th Street. And so it's a very tight knit community. And I think that, you know, my grandfather, that was one of the things we at Robert Mondavi back in the day, back in the beginning, we had just people coming through the winery. I mean, one of our first winemakers, you know, Mike Gergish, Warren Ranowski, so many people that went on to do wonderful things. And I see a lot of that happening in Sonoma, and a lot of the faces here today are a product of that, just kind of going on and doing their own project, getting the help from either friends of their family or their family or just friends. And so I think the community is incredibly strong. And that's one of the things I love about Sonoma. And that's also one of the things I love about, I have to say that I think that that's kind of an international thing. I mean, one of my internships was in Burgundy, and there was just so many people that had been through the domain that I was at in Burgundy. Actually, the winery that I interned at in Burgundy, so Jeremy Sess from Domaine Dujac interned with my family back in '98. So there's just this kind of global community. Once you start traveling, you realize how small it is. And but it certainly is incredibly powerful. And I have to say that Sonoma is incredible. And going back to the whole terroir, people are there for a reason. People are there because they want to make wines that can sit alongside of the best wines of the world. And when we all realize that if my terroir, if I'm treating it well, if I'm farming, my vineyard at a high level, my neighbor's farming at a high level, you really want everyone to kind of be at that high level. It's that idea that in farming, we're only as good as kind of the least good in our community, if you will. And so there's really a communal sense in the wine industry, and Sonoma certainly I love it. I love my neighbors. I get a pass by Jasmine. I always knock on the door. Hey, when I'm going out to the Halpa Ranch, and it's a wonderful place to be. And I feel very fortunate to be able to be on this panel with everyone, all my neighbors and friends, but also to be in the community that's much greater than just the six of us here today. So.
Thank you. I'm posting in the chat. There's have been a couple of Q&As posed about your wines, what you're making. So I just posted a link in the chat if you'd like to sort of check out what the wines behind me and what these fabulous vintners have to offer. You can follow that. So on that topic, though, kind of talking about community and obviously the sort of gracious hospitality amongst vintners. Artie, I'd like to pose this question to you because I know that in your Wine XYZ, you consult for wineries. So kind of putting on your consulting hat, what advice would you give? What things do you think that that certain Sonoma wineries are doing a great job of it in terms of communication and hospitality? And where do you think that there's room for improvement with consumers?
That's a great question because I've had a lot of these conversations with George. We always bounce ideas off of each other. I think the main thing is Sonoma just has its own vibe. And the thing that worries me is when regions mimic other regions or try to live up to other regions. I think Sonoma's Sonoma, and when I drive over there, I feel a different way. And that's what I want to have captured in the experience, so wineries that are very, in tune with what that vibe is are going to do very well. I think keeping the experience elevated in terms of the service is very important anywhere. It's just not a high-end thing. It's just how we take care of each other. That's what hospitality means. It means that we really care about taking care of the client. And in all honesty, I don't believe that great service is scalable. We always talk about scaling and scaling. Well, it's not scalable because it's very hard. And it's hard because it's very important. So I think the wineries that are doing it well over there understand that, Sonoma's this place and it's quaint, it's cozy, it's welcoming, it's all of those things. So that should be the voice of Sonoma. And it doesn't mean that you can't elevate and do something high end, but clients really identify with uniqueness, and it's kind of like be who you are. And I make wine all over the state, from Santa Barbara County all the way up to Mendocino County. I'm in Contra Costa, I'm on the Sonoma coast. I'm in Napa, I'm in Sonoma. So I really get to see these different personalities. And I love to see when a winery can capture the personality of the region, because that's going to make clients continue to go back, because that's the only place they can go to get that. And you think about Italy, you think about going to Piemonte or Tuscany or Bulgari. I love them all, but they're all so different. And the Italians are very confident being who they are. So I think that's the future of Sonoma, is continuing to be Sonoma at an elevated level.
Got it. So we have obviously such a prestigious group of vintners and winemakers on this panel, but there's also sort of a very interesting background, outside of the wine business represented here as well. So Jasmine, I'd love to actually pose this to you, because as I read in your bio, you worked in the business world before sort of coming back home. So were there any things that you learned outside of the wine industry, in that business sense, that you sort of brought back with you and that you can see making change today?
Well, I think it's such a good question. I mean, I think that our goal with whatever work we do should be, to be the best, right? And I worked in private banking at JP Morgan, and I had the most difficult boss. She was so demanding. She was a perfectionist, right? So we say this is a difficult boss, right? But really what she expected from us was that we go above and beyond, and that nothing was ever, you're never finished. It could always, the work could always be better. And I think that that's relevant to any job. And, and I think basic things around professionalism and actually a lot about how to interact with clients. And I really love what Artie just said. I think, what, Oscar Wilde said, be yourself because everyone else is taken. But how do we do that at like a really professional level and a way that we can also really connect with others? So I think that was definitely something that I learned in the business world. And the other thing I would say too is we're a tiny business. I mean, we're a very small family business. When I took over as general manager and was slowly, taking things over more leading up to that point, it's just so helpful. I mean, we have to do all kinds of things. I mean, I know all of us probably also take out the trash at our family winery sometimes, but we also have to like read contracts and understand health insurance plans for our employees and stuff that at bigger organizations, you might be able to hire somebody to do that for you. So just having a good general business background, was definitely really helpful. Oh, yeah.
So sort of, George, same question for you. And also in that, coming to the wine industry, founding this winery, what did you bring to it? And what were some things, if any, that you thought, wow, nothing that I've ever encountered in my previous career could have prepared me for this?
Well, I think a little bit comes from, my dad and I, coming from the finance world, thought that we knew what made a small business successful. And, but at the same time, the wine business is its own unique beast, and you don't necessarily need to try to change things for the sake of changing them, because some things work and they've worked for a really long time. That doesn't mean that they can't be improved upon, but I think that was one of the big kind of eye-opening moments for me. And I think one of the other ones was going back to one of your earlier questions, I think maybe to Jasmine, just, coming from the investment world, there wasn't kind of a lot of mutual appreciation between myself and our competitors. We're always trying to vie for the same clients, for the same dollars, looking at the same companies, had different opinions about where we wanted to buy X company and where we wanted to sell it for. And the wine business, what I've really enjoyed, and to use another, to talk about an individual Artie brought up, Phil Katori was instrumental for me when I came back to start working for the family business. We got through harvest, and then he shipped off to Australia to do another harvest there. And we had just started working with Phil, and I had to start working on a bunch of vineyard decisions with him. And one of the greatest things was he answered all of my very rudimentary and elementary questions just about growing grapes, vineyards in general, because I am not one to hold back in asking questions. And he was one of my biggest mentors in just really helping me understand vineyards in general, viticulture, and that was great. But to Jasmine's point as well, I think, in Sonoma, in some other wineries, it was more of a little bit of kind of a I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but more of kind of a laid back culture. And what we tried to bring was, kind of true business sense, that this isn't just a hobby for us. This is something that we hope that we can hand off to our next generation, and a viable kind of growing and healthy business. And we want to make sure that, it's one thing to make really great wine. And Morgan might say differently, but it's really hard to sell said wine as well. It's a discretionary income product. And I think just having some of that business sense in terms of, and sales background was really beneficial for myself and my father, in terms of, as Artie says, just thinking about the hospitality experience, the direct to consumer business, because we can't keep up with some of the big Jacksons of the world or the Gallos in the world trying to vie for shelf space. And we're just going to set ourselves up for failure. So really thinking about the whole customer experience and whatnot, and how we're going to use that and develop these recurring relationships with our customers and clients was something we try to think a lot about and bring some of what we've learned in previous life's industries, professions in terms of how to build upon that.
Wow. So sticking with this sort of the theme of this question, Morgan, back to you. As I read in your bio, you have a master's degree in American Studies from Columbia University. We need to talk, actually. I think we were both on the Upper West Side at the same time. I didn't realize this, but so kind of same question, like how did those studies guide you in sort of in your winemaking, if at all? And what changes have you made because of that?
Yes, I mean, I came out of the lovely cocoon of Vassar College at Georgetown. We both went to small liberal arts schools in the Hudson River Valley. So we came out of the cocoon, and I really thought I wanted to be a history professor. And going to Columbia was really good because it allowed me to explore that. It also allowed me to learn that I was going to be a very bad academic because I just was not into it as much as I should be. And throughout the whole time I was in college and graduate school, I was working retail. I was working at a couple shops up in the Hudson River Valley in Poughkeepsie. And then I actually met my current business partner, Chris, working at a place called Pet Wines in the Upper East Side. You know, I think that it sort of cured me of academia, but it didn't cure me of my love of history. And what I love so much about what we do now at Bedrock, where I really feel like we're about curating and rehabilitating these old vineyards, is we actually get to work with living history, and we actually really, you know, and there's a preservationist aspect to what we do. And unlike my, you know, my papers about 19th century jurisprudential history and Stephen J. Field and the Ninth Circuit Court, people actually want to drink wine. So, you know, I think that part of it is also much more gratifying. So I would say that it certainly informs a lot of what I did. And I mean, it informs my love of history. And, you know, and I also think that just having that, you know, that more broad academic and liberal arts background, I think is actually really helpful, because when you're running a small winery, you literally are doing every single facet. You are talking to every manner of consumer out in the market. You have to be able to be well-versed in talking about everything, but you have to write, you have to be able to think critically. And, you know, also you have to be able to learn how to read a balance sheet and a P&L. And I mean, I think that one of the things that I'm just kind of, you know, envious of Jasmine and George about is, for me, that was my weak spot. You know, we can be incredible craftsmen and we can make incredible wines that are evocative of these great places in the world. But if we can't run a viable business, and if we can't take care of our employees, and if we can't, you know, figure out how to do that, then that just all goes away. So it's really finding the balance between those two things. And I think all of our backgrounds collectively, I think, have contributed us to be successful in that part of things in a particular way. And I don't think that can be understated.
So Artie, sort of same vein, but going back to your previous experience as a somm. So how did that experience, you know, sort of being table side with consumers, are you able to take that and apply that in different ways to your business now?
I mean, definitely, you know, working on the restaurant floor is interesting because, you know, most of the clients you don't know, and, you know, you walk up to the table, you don't know them, they don't know you. You have a wine list, you know, they're looking at it. You have maybe a 30-second to 40-second conversation about the wine, and you try to tell some kind of story, and then you come back, open it, and then you check on them again, and before you know it, they're gone. So I really appreciate being able to sit down with a client for an hour and a half or 2 hours and getting to know them and talking about the wines in a different way. So I think having those quick encounters on the floor today, I'm so appreciative of being able to connect with the client. And some of the clients is different than a restaurant, because some of my clients I might not see for 2 or 3 years. I'll talk to them on the phone or I'll email them, but that time that you get to sit down with them is so important. And one of the things I worry about is we live in this kind of universe where we need to like schedule appointments, right? Like 1 at 11, 1 at 1:30, 1 at 3:30, you know, and maybe I don't want the client to leave. Maybe we just want to continue to talk. So we have this amazing opportunity as wineries to spend time with our clients, because without our clients, we don't have a business, right? If people don't buy your wine, then you have a wine collection, and we're not trying to do that. So the restaurant business taught me that, you know, we have it a little bit easier in a way on the wine side of how we can connect with our client. In a restaurant, the time is crunched so much that you're not able to establish that relationship.
Yeah. And Artie, if I could stick with you just for a moment, again, as I read in your bio, you've worked for some pretty prestigious wineries in Napa. I mean, Harlan, Mayacamas, and of course with Staglin. So what, if any, did you learn about your experience there with consumers that you've taken on a sort of smaller scale, on a startup scale?
Yeah, I mean, different things from each place. I think the first thing when you go into one of the wineries is you have to understand the personality. So you have to figure out how you fit into that personality. You know, what I wore at Harlan was very different from what I wore at Mayacamas, right? Like, because it was a different terrain, it was a different message. So before you can contribute, you have to come in and you have to interpret, you have to understand. I think at Harlan, you're selling an expensive bottle of wine. So I think at a certain point, you have to over deliver, because if you don't over deliver, you're already under delivering based on the cost of the wine. Yeah. Mayacamas, we had to start something. It was, people don't remember this, but there wasn't a whole lot going on up there, and we got up there and we got it going, and it's cool to see that, but it's a different type of responsibility when you have to set everything up, and I think for Staglin, because I am a steward of that project through marriage, I think it's understanding kind of what your role will be in the future. That's important for me. And the role that I have now is not going to be the same role that I have 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So there's a certain amount of humility that goes with understanding what you need to do today, and then prepare yourself for what you need to do tomorrow. But all three of those wineries are on the high end, and I don't want to sound like I'm repeating myself, but there's a certain expectation of service and hospitality that goes with the price points on those wines, and that's one thing I don't want us to forget, because sometimes you get desensitized, right? To the, I remember when I wouldn't spend $10 on a bottle of wine. My parents never drank wine. Still today, sometimes when I go buy wine, I get sticker shock. So I have to remember that clients come into town and they spend a lot of money. So what I want them to do is when they leave on that plane, I want them to feel like they got a lot more than their money's worth. And my experiences at all three of those wineries have taught me how important that is.
So I'd like to talk a bit about the future. And Carlo, I'd love to pose this question to you, because R in RAEN, of course, stands for research. So what is it that you're researching currently? And then what impact do you hope that will have on the future of your winery, but of Sonoma as a whole?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think, when you look back at my grandfather's generation, the 60s, or even our parents' generation, late 60s, early 70s, 80s, 90s, the big thing was understanding the science of winemaking. We didn't know what malolactic fermentation. My dad didn't know what that was when he began. And or Brettanomyces, what was the causation? We still are scratching our heads on some of these things. We know what's Eniococcus, what's Pediococcus, what's all these things happening on the science of winemaking. And I think because of the hard work that our grandparents' generation and our father's generation, or my father's generation, my grandfather's generation did, we understand the science of winemaking. And so right now, where I'm dedicating a lot of my time is in the science of farming, kind of understanding of farming. I think that during that same time, just before that was the Green Revolution, post World War I and World War II, where there was just this flood of chemicals and the chemical industry took over. And, in 74, with the beginning of Roundup and glyphosate, and kind of the propagation of all that, we kind of, in the farming community, I'm talking on a global farming community basis, got kind of sold into a very conventional, safety, this is what you should do 101 kind of doctrine of farming. And the area that I think Dante and I have been spending most of our time with at RAEN is researching permaculture, polyculture, so stressing biodiversity, trying to figure out how can you create this permanent circular kind of farming where if there's a problem on the farm, there's some sort of, beneficial flower that brings in beneficial insects that kicks it out. We've been doing this. One of the cool examples of this was bluebird boxes for blue-green sharpshooters. Bluebirds happen to love blue-green sharpshooters, and in riparian habitats, blue-green sharpshooters are the vector for Pierce disease, and they don't typically love the way that vines taste, but they'll bite onto one and then bite onto a second, and they'll say, we don't like this, and they'll take off. But by that time, they've essentially compromised those two vines that they've passed on Pierce disease. And so just planting bluebird boxes. I remember the first time we planted these we installed bluebird boxes down at Royal St. Robert and Bodega, just kind of there in Freestone and Occidental. And by the time I had gone up to Royal St. Robert block and I came back down, there was a bluebird. We put like 18 boxes out. There was a bluebird sitting on one of these boxes. And now we have an unbelievable amount of bluebirds on the farm. The blue-green sharpshooter population has come down. The replants are taking root from the vines that did get hit with Pierce disease. And so we're seeing, that permaculture can be an incredible way to combat disease pressure. The other thing that's really interesting is, I don't know if you've seen the study that came out of Cornell University, but this idea that, we do spore trappings. So we're capturing spores to try to understand when we have the potential for different mildew pressures in the vineyard. And then we can treat those mildew pressures, or if they're not present, we don't have to spray per se. And so just being able to kind of research and understand what is the best way that we can work with nature without treading on nature and creating an environment within a farm that truly stresses biodiversity and creates a healthy, dynamic, piece of environment. And I truly believe that this also ties to the quality of the wine, because when you taste wine, you smell not just the minerals of the earth and the climate and the location, you're also smelling and tasting the microflora, that energy that's surrounding the vineyard. So the energy from resin, from the flowers and the grasses and the trees and the dirt, all of this stick to that wax on the grape, and that wax we call the bloom. And so there's so much that I think you can do. And also, I just want to say that my hat is off to everyone on this panel, because I know George is farming biodynamically. I know Morgan, your farming is unbelievably beautiful. And one of the great pleasures I have in my commutes is driving by Hirsch Vineyards on my way to the Hellenthal Ranch to our Seafield Vineyard. And when I drive, that vineyard is just gorgeous. And I know Jasmine, I won't talk about your farm, but I know you converted to biodynamics, and it's just one of the most gorgeous plots of land. And so I think the biggest thing that we can continue to research and continue to push and continue to study is agriculture, and not in the sense of like that's why also in the R, it's not viticulture after that, it's researching agriculture and enology naturally, because it's a whole farm. So that's an area I'm very passionate about. It's an area I think that we can continue to improve the most in winemaking, because again, thanks to the hard work of my grandfather's generation and my father's generation and some from the early years, but really agriculture is the area I think that we need to continue to push. And certainly don't take our foot off the pedal on understanding winemaking, but that's where I dedicated my time, is in agriculture and viticulture. So.
Well, Jasmine, I'd like to move to you. I know that speaking again about sort of the future, towards the beginning of this panel, you mentioned, I think climate came up a number of times. So in terms of climate and the future, what sort of changes or actions or steps are you taking? And then what do you think the specific impact will be, not just in the vineyard, but in the glass?
I think, it was really interesting listening to what Morgan was saying about planting wide space vineyards. I mean, the trend these days is to plant super, densely planted vineyards and there's just, and of course, I mean, I don't know anybody that's planted a recent field blend on any kind of scale. I mean, nobody does that, right? So it's like we're all still, as a wine industry, kind of doing what we did 10, 20 years ago, and yet the climate is changing rapidly around us, right? And much faster than our plants can adapt, right? I honestly think, you know, we're getting ready to plant a small vineyard, an extension of one of our existing vineyards, just 2 acres. And, you know, we're asking ourselves the old questions, you know, like what rootstock do we want to use? Do we want to plant Chardonnay or do we want to plant Pinot? And it's like, which of our selections are we going to use? And it's like, should we be asking ourselves completely different questions? Should we be considering new varieties? Should we be, you know, something that we are more and more interested in here at Hirsch, and there's a Morgan, you know, you're wait for my email, because I am going to be coming to bug you about dry farming and trying to learn more about that. We have an abundance of water here at Hirsch. We're extraordinarily lucky. But I think with increased climate complexity, increased variability in our weather, more extreme highs, more extreme lows, anything we can do to increase the resilience of our plants is super important. And dry farming might be one way to do that. So the added benefit, of course, that Morgan mentioned of using less of this extraordinarily important resource, water, but also helping our plants to become more climate resilient. And I think some of the things that Carlo talked about tie into that as well, right? You know, biodiversity, polyculture is a hedge. Morgan, you mentioned, you know, planting field blends as a hedge. You know, if one variety doesn't do great this year, another one will pick up the slack. Mm-hmm. I think when you look at the way agriculture is done conventionally on a large scale now, like it is so insanely unsustainable. And I don't just mean unsustainable in the kind of weak green word sustainable. I just mean as a business, it's just not, it's not gonna be, the planet is not gonna support that. The climate is not gonna support that long-term. So we need to quickly start asking ourselves questions about that would represent dramatic changes to how we farm and how we run our businesses. And so I guess I'm kind of skirting around the thing, which is, you know, we're known for Pinot Noir. We have 68 acres of Pinot, 4 acres of Chardonnay. That's all we have planted here. In 20 years, is this going to be a great site for Pinot? I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure anymore. In the last 5 years, you know, I have become unsure of the answer of that question. And I think that that's an extraordinarily scary thing to admit, but yeah, I mean, so the answer to your question is, of course, we're doing all the small things, but you know, we're also starting to work up our courage to internally ask ourselves these bigger questions too.
Yeah. There's a question that came in from a viewer at home, also about the future, which Artie, I'd like to pose to you, which is, are there changes you've made as a result of adapting your business to the world of COVID, quarantines, et cetera, that you think will last post-COVID for better or for worse?
That's a great question. I mean, I think if you took your direct-to-consumer and your relationships seriously, you were happy you did during COVID. So I think that was a litmus test of how important direct-to-consumer was, because a lot of times we get super caught up in being able to give this experience. And when you're not able to give that experience, do your clients still have your back? And in many cases, I saw that they did. So, you know, we all of us put in a lot of great work and energy, and we need to continue to do that. You know, I think it's sometimes in the wine business, we get accused of being resistant to technology. And, you know, I mean, the fact that we're all here doing this, you know, on the Zoom, I think is super cool. And I mean, we might not do as much of it, but we're still going to do it. I think we need to continue to be open-minded and evolve and use technology and think about ways that we could reach out to our clients. I've been a part of some like amazing like virtual dinners and things that if you asked me 2 years ago if that was possible, I would have said, oh, that's not gonna, you know, how could that be that interesting? And people would call and they thanked me and they were excited about it. So I think we need to look at what worked during the period, what didn't work, and evolution is shedding the things that don't work and continuing to do the things that do work. And one of my favorite Sonoma days was when Carlo was making his wines over at Morgan's. And I don't know if they remember, but I showed up because I don't even think I was making wine at that time, because I was just going everywhere. I needed to see everything. And, I was super curious. So I went over there and Carlo had all his Pinot laid out and these little tiny clusters, and I was like, man, those are small. And I was just so green at that time. And I remember talking to Morgan, and he's showing me around and everything. And I think one of the cool things about Sonoma is everybody is really pumped up about agriculture and making wine and also having a good time too. So I remember that, and I totally appreciate that. I don't know if you guys remember that, but I had to say that because that was a special moment.
I've got a photo from that day, like a picture of the three of us, which is awesome.
I totally remember, because I remember RAEN was bringing in Pinot Noir, and we were doing the really cool like Dujac layering of cluster and all of this stuff, which is really awesome. And then but all these like tiny little, I don't know whether it was Royal St. Robert or what had come in that day. And then also we have like a Zinfandel pick that came in that day, and Artie's just picking up this Zinfandel cluster that's like this big, and we're like, yeah, they're different. So they're very different.
That was awesome.
Come a long way, Morgan.
Yeah. Hey man, you're making Alicante Boucher these days, so
Right.
I
So Morgan, I know you have a very young one at home. So again, sort of looking towards the future, if you were to advise, your next generation on kind of how to approach the next, 20, 30 years and beyond, assuming they follow in your footsteps, what would your advice be?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think that, what Jasmine was alluding to about, decisions about like coming back to core questions and core tenets, like what works, what doesn't work, what's going to potentially work. There's some real like hard existential questions that I think that our generation has to grapple with to ensure success moving forward. That, I think that our parents maybe had the luxury of they had other existential issues, like, making sure that the California wine industry became like solvent and stuff like that. But my dad was convincing people that Zinfandel wasn't pink for like 15 years. So but it's a really good question. And yeah, even at Bedrock, we're looking to areas of the world that we think are more representative of the growing climate that we have. Sonoma Valley is, we have bay influence, but it can be warm. It's definitely a very Mediterranean climate. You look at the fauna, the flora that, surrounds George and my places, and it's Manzanita and Laurel Bay and, dry land scrub in many ways. So what works in those situations? And so even though we're working to redevelop all these old vineyards, and I think that, these old Mediterranean varieties work pretty well, we're redeveloping 11 acres at Bedrock, which honestly I think will be the biggest development that will be made in my lifetime. And so we're thinking really, really hard about what is going to go there. And so yes, we're doing some Zinfandel and we're doing Carignan and Mataro, but we're also doing mixed plantings of Touraiga Nacional and Tinta Baraka and Tinta Cow, and varieties that retain elegance and perfume and acidity in warm climates. And as we're redeveloping white blocks, we're looking at Mediterranean white varieties that retain acidity and poise, but can be potentially tank fermented in stainless steel or sea oak, things like Gadeo or Guveo, things like Arinto, things like Viagino, things like Acertico, these varieties. And I think that, it might take a long time for people to begin to learn how to pronounce a lot of them, but at the same time, I think it's really important that we be thinking about what is going to allow us to accomplish the style of wines that we want to make. Because I do think, we grow Cabernet at Bedrock, and it's really, really good. I'm not sure if it's going to be great in 20 years. And, and I do think we need to acknowledge the fact that at least in Sonoma Valley, we have a very Mediterranean climate. So relying on a grape that, may have been the favorite of the Duke of Burgundy in the 1550s, or a grape that comes from a maritime region and in the Aquitaine of France, may not be the best long-term solution to what needs to happen. And every region and sub-region of California, I think, needs to confront that. and it's really, really hard because it's really, really scary and expensive to install new vineyards, and they're supposed to last for a really, really long time. So it's, you know, the decisions are not ones to be made lightly, but at the same time, I think it's a little necessary to be thinking, you know, beyond what our comfort zone is right now in some ways, because we're going to be out of our comfort zone whether we want it or not. So.
George, same question to you. You know, looking at the future, then, you know, what are there decisions that, you know, you sort of make on a day-to-day basis now that you think will look very different, let's say the next generation of your family when they take over?
Yeah, so I think, you know, I mimic a lot of the things that Jasmine said, Morgan said, everybody said on the panel. You know, we were talking before we went live about rain, and not Carlo's winery here, but just actual precipitation that falls from the sky, and how little we're actually getting this year. And it's scary when we're coming off of 4 years of really intense fires and smoke, and, you know, having this smoke enter way earlier than it has in the past this past year. And, you know, we're making some decisions now to pruning in terms of how early that we're starting to prune, just with the idea that, you know, those late summer, early fall, like extreme heat events, you know, not asking the vine and those grapes to, you know, for, as Morgan was talking about, like acidity and whatnot, and the tannin structure on some of these wines, getting these huge heat events can just really wipe out a lot of the great work that you've done throughout the entirety of the growing season. We've also, at our mountain property, Nuns Canyon Vineyard, planted about 6 acres of Grenache. And so looking at some more kind of drought tolerant varietals, as Morgan was talking about, in terms of starting to do some R&D there in terms of, you know, what we think can grow great at some of the sites that we do want to develop over time. But, you know, I think everybody on this panel is of the like mind that we really want to show the terroir of these unique vineyard sites. And as one thing that Morgan was talking about, and Jasmine, in terms of dry farming, you know, I think dry farming is really important when you're really asking, if you're really taking terroir seriously. I think you're asking the vine to struggle a little bit and really looking for that deep rooting. And because I think that it's just more expressive of the place that it's growing, if those roots are really shooting down pretty far. Like up at our Nuns Canyon Vineyard, we have a lot of shattered basalt, and I think basalt just generally, you know, starts to fracture and makes these bricks. And, you know, we dig these soil pits and you see these root hairs that are so vibrant in like the smallest crevices. And it's in those crevices that it's, as Pedro Parra says, it's kind of like going to, you know, 4 or 5-star Michelin restaurant or whatnot. You know, that is so nutrient filled that, you know, it's really wonderful. And then at the same time, you know, last year we dry farmed about 67% of our 94 acres that we farm. And what that is equivalent of saving, if we were just on a normal watering schedule, is about 2 million gallons of water. And so when you think about that in a really extreme heat year, we were getting 116 degrees down at our property, Morgan, you know, like in September. And I mean, that was the hottest day on record since we've been tracking temperatures. And so, you know, we're trying to do different things to kind of confront, one, you know, some of the climate change, some of the things that are happening because of climate change. And a lot of that has to do with fire, water, and, you know, just kind of thinking about, as Morgan just so eloquently put, you know, our future planning decisions, and what Jasmine was talking about, you know, what has grown so great and why we fell in love with some of these vineyards. Are those going to be the same varietals? You know, if our kids want to get involved in our different companies, are those going to be the varietals that they're going to be growing at the time?
Well, and thank you for touching on the fires. There were a couple of questions in the chat asking for comments on that. So I also posted, we were getting a number of questions about your wines. So I did post in the chat again a link to the wines from the panelists. We are running close to time, and so I apologize for not being able to answer all the questions in the chat, although thank you for being so engaged. But sort of in closing, I guess, Carlo, I started with you. I'll pose this kind of last question to you, and then I'd love to hear from the rest of you as well. But, you know, so speaking of you specifically, Carlo, we talked a lot today about your grandfather, the legacy that he's left, you know, and so let's say, you know, a generation from now, two generations from now, there's a book being written about, you know, about this time in Sonoma. You know, what do you hope that people will know, and what do you think they'll take away and learn?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing I hope is that it's talking about the community, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, and how we rose above all this challenges that we're facing right now. One of the things, you know, in starting the Monarch Challenge, it's actually we're going on our 5th year now. You know, I had this like idea that we were going to be able to simply, just by creating awareness that herbicides were actually bad for you and that were bad for the environment, that we were just going to magically get rid of herbicides. And I quickly realized that until you can change the economic picture, that the big farms, because, you know, we all farm, you know, beyond beautifully. I would kiss the ground of all of the panelists today that they farm, because I know how passionate they are about farming, and I know how passionate they are about protecting our planet. And so in the Monarch Challenge, you know, I learned quickly that the big farms, you know, when you looked at my family's farm, we had 8,000 acres in the state, just in the state of California, that immediately got converted to conventional practices. And so as the consolidation of these medium-sized to large and even some small wineries were being bought, they're just being put into this kind of conventional 101 farming. And my hope is that that our generation will correct that, and that through technologies, and I'm not trying to shamelessly plug Monarch Tractor, but one of the cool things about this journey was that it was actually really depressing, because about 3 years ago, I just didn't think that it was going to happen. And I almost wanted to just give it up and just say, okay, I can't do this. This is going to be impossible. Just hitting wall after wall. And it was actually Tesla. I don't know if you guys have driven the Tesla down the freeway. You know, they go like in autonomy mode, you put it in ludicrous mode, and it can change lanes and all that. And I realized, man, if you can drive a car down a freeway with all these crazy things happening, you can drive a tractor down a vineyard road 2 and 3 miles per hour, and you can make it an electric, and you can help solve, you know, because when you turn on one tractor, it's like turning on 17 vehicles right now. They're really, really unchecked in terms of their carbon footprint. And so, and that bridged over to this idea of what about getting away from fossil fuel farming into renewable energy farming, and being able to actually have dual crops on your farm. So you're not just farming vineyards, you actually also have a little power plant. So you're farming energy, and that you are completely off the grid. And so this whole thing began, and I think that it's the key to allowing for us to economically, in big farms, to economically take that step forward into the beyond organic world. And hopefully that organic becomes the new conventional, and that we're all geeking out on who's more regenerative and biodynamic, and who's got more polyculture on their farm, and what's going on. And so that is what I hope that our generation leaves behind, is a better planet, a better agriculture. Like Jasmine was talking about, we can't really sustain in the way that we're farming now. It's just unsustainable on a global basis. And so how do we move forward? And I think that is a challenge that we have to solve. And I've been working on that with the Monarch Challenge. We found what we think is a pretty incredible solution with Monarch Tractor, which is this electric driver optional tractor that will hopefully solve the carbon footprint challenge of going organic. Because right now, when you go into these beyond organic practices, not for everyone, not in some sandy soils and some beautiful places, but in a lot of areas, it comes with a greater carbon footprint because you have to do more passes. And so being able to solve that carbon footprint divide, and then also the economic divide, to allow for farms to be able to do that without having it cost them a greater amount. Because whether I like to admit it or not, farmers are very conservative. And so if we're going to make change, we have to make sure that it is an economic upside for them. And so I think that that's the biggest thing. And I don't know if I quite answered your question, Vanessa, but I hope our generation leaves behind a better planet, and that hopefully that we can come to some sort of place of climate stability. And then a lot of these varieties that I think are so special, like Hirsch Vineyard, you know, is a sacred piece of vineyard land in California. And I don't want to see it be planted to anything but Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. So I hope that we can keep that, and that's on us to fix, you guys. I think it's on us. So, you know, I think we'll get there. I hope.
I'm sure. Well, thank you so much to this panel. I wanted to also thank everyone who was watching and for the great questions, and please forgive me for not being able to post all of them in the time we have. But I think what I've taken away from today is this is, you know, a moment in time of really dynamic change, and I feel like we should probably reconvene in the future and kind of check in as to where everyone is and have another conversation. But again, you know, Jasmine, Morgan, George, Carlo, Artie, such an honor. And truly, you are the future, you know, of Napa. You are modern Sonoma, excuse me, of Sonoma. So this is such an honor. It's been such an engaging conversation, and I can't wait to check in again with you in a couple of years. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, and cheers to your beautiful wines.
Cheers.
Thank you, Vanessa. Cheers.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Bye bye.
Thank you, Vanessa.